Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 60th episode of the PP Political Podcast. I'm Eshan Pokrell,
And I'm Michael Boddicker.
and today we're going back to history, and we're going to talk about the first FDR election, and then just in general the FDR presidency through the Great Depression, through World War II.
Yep.
And yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. Off the bat, Herbert Hoover, probably one of the worst presidents in American history. There is a case for top five, I would say, just because of his absolute incompetency in running the country. Really sped us into the Great Depression, and yeah, and then he had the nerve to run for re-election. And yeah, FDR came along. So Boddicker, you can go ahead and just background of who FDR was, and then like election results. We get into that.
Sure. FDR, former vice presidential candidate under James Cox in 1920. They got destroyed to Warren G. Harding. He was obviously a Democrat from New York. He's basically he's a sickly child. He was graduated. His father graduated from Harvard Law. Actually, excuse me on sickly. He was more of an athlete. Theodore was more sickly than he was, but obviously he gets polio in his adult life. That kind of cripples him in terms of his mobility. And a lot of work is actually done during his presidency and during his time in political life to kind of negate the optical effects of polio, because I don't think it actually was super widely publicized during his they tried to kind of keep it under wraps as much as they could. He actually married his fifth cousin once removed, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was one of Theodore Roosevelt's nieces. He was he was a New York State senator, assistant secretary of the Navy, campaigned for vice president. He was immensely qualified to be president, and obviously also serves as governor of New York from 1929 to 1932. He's a progressive by all accounts. FDR was a progressive and certainly had a bold vision for the country. And obviously, we'll talk about it a little bit after the election, but in terms of his New Deal policies that basically redefined the American bargain and the relationship between citizens and government.
Yeah. FDR is probably one of the most famous presidents since Abraham Lincoln, probably the most famous president since Abraham Lincoln. And electorally, he was an absolute juggernaut. So, I mean, absolutely destroying Herbert Hoover in the election of 1932. FDR won 42 states. He was always kind of the front runner for the DNC's nomination. Took him 4 ballots to succeed to clinch the nomination at the convention, but he got it done. He campaigned on the New Deal, so his most famous accomplishment, obviously, he did campaign on it. And yeah, I mean, 42 states carried, 472 electoral votes. Herbert Hoover with only 59. Basically the end of the, like they said, I think we mentioned the party systems in a couple episodes back. The end of the fourth party system, that was basically from the end of the Civil War through Reconstruction all the way to now, where Republicans were dominating the electoral stage nationally. It's over now. First time since 1916 a Democrat was elected president. Obviously, that was Woodrow Wilson winning re-election. Also, the first time since, I believe, 1876, a Democrat won the majority, the popular vote. And so Democrats were kind of not invisible, but they weren't at the forefront the last years, and FDR really did change that from a political perspective. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into the FDR years, and obviously starting off with the Great Depression, the first vestiges of World War II started popping up throughout this first term. You have anything big you want to cover off the bat here?
Well, I'd actually like to take a second to make an aside. I actually think that Woodrow Wilson, or no, just kidding. Woodrow Wilson is not going to be a part of this episode. Just kidding. Herbert Hoover. I think actually Herbert Hoover is one of the most overhated presidents in American history. That's a hot take, but I think that Hoover's often blamed for the Great Depression, and I think that there is some standing for that. But obviously, in terms of the economy, in terms of the way that the free market works, and especially worked back then, um, the market was prone to crash, especially during the speculation of the 20s. And how much of that you can place on Hoover, I wouldn't place too much of that blame on Hoover. I think that the ebbs and flows of that market were going to lead to a crash at some point. And it just also happened that the panic that wasn't managed well by pretty much anybody fell on Hoover, obviously, as the chief executive. And Hoover did try. Hoover earnestly tried. Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce. Hoover was also an immensely talented and intelligent guy. And he actually outlives, I believe, he outlives FDR. He outlives Eisenhower. He outlives, I think, Truman. He may outlive Truman. He lives into like the 1960s. I mean, Hoover lives a long time. He's a super intelligent gentleman. But unfortunately, I think Hoover is a little overhated because he gets caught in the crossfire and is also, he's also led, the president right after him is considered one of the greatest and most influential presidents in American history. Hoover, so I think Hoover often gets James Buchanan when I think Hoover's not necessarily the level of incompetence of Buchanan or Pierce or Wilson or Harding or even Andrew Johnson. So I think that's my little aside on Hoover. Now, getting back to FDR, we're talking about a man that is using, he's a pioneer of radio and media. FDR, in terms of later getting into his presidency with fireside chats, revolutionizing mass media, and especially the power of the presidency. He was completely dominant. Republicans tried to run Alf Landon against him in 1936. Hearts of Iron Fort legend Alf Landon.
Shout out to Alf Landon.
He gets destroyed.
America's governor, really, if you think about it.
But America, of course. So Roosevelt, I mean, there are so many pieces of legislation from the New Deal that, I mean, because it was a truly massive expansion and redefinition of the scope and size of government. So, there's the Emergency Banking Act, which, stopped bank runs, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the AAA agriculture policies, the WPA, Social Security, that's the big one, which is probably going to go insolvent if we don't fix it at some point. Oopsie daisies. The National Labor Relations Act, in terms of guaranteeing the right to collectively bargain. Roosevelt also engaged in some questionable things, I would say, in terms of attempting to pack the court and intimidate the court. But I would say that while it wasn't great, I think that there is not precedent, but it's certainly not unprecedented in American history, especially when you consider Andrew Jackson and his famous apocryphal, the courts made their decision, let them enforce it. I think FDR was really quite tempted to do kind of the same thing. But in terms of his pre-World War policy, it was extremely focused on the economy. And in terms of just improving the morale of Americans and the way that they viewed themselves throughout the world, especially considering that this is a time of just pure desolation. The economy was completely crippled, 25% unemployment. Something had to go, and it was FDR that kind of provided that lever to kind of to claw everything out. Except there are debates now because we were far enough out that FDR's policies actually extended the Depression. Like there's a huge, I think it was a Yale study that the New Deal actually extended the Depression by 2 or 3 years, which is kind of a lot of time when you think about it.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with that, but I definitely think that the moral and the way that FDR was able to convey optimism to the American people was pretty helpful.
Yeah, and maybe I was a little harsh on Herbert Hoover. I think his mainly the real reason people have a negative opinion of him Because he did have a really big career prior to becoming president, Secretary of Commerce. Like you said, he was the food czar basically during World War One, the post
Yeah.
World War One time, which everybody kind of forgets about, all of that. But I think it was just like when you compare him to FDR, I guess that's what it is. I mean, but like it or not, FDR was a very impactful president, and I say
Yeah.
like it or not, just because like the power that he expanded on the role that no president's given back, but which is something we can talk about. But when you look, at what Hoover's, I guess, is inaction compared to FDR's very blatant action, that's where it gets a little unfortunate for FDR. Also, FDR, looking at his electoral history, ran against Alf Landon in 1936. An
There you go.
absolute dog. Didn't win his own state. He carried two states. He carried Maine and Vermont. So two juggernauts there. Probably the most lopsided electoral victory in history probably we'll ever see. 523 to 8.
Alf, you're a hero to me, Alf. I promise. Hero to me.
523 to 8 on the electoral count. Absolutely disgusting. 61% of the popular vote to FDR. Absolutely brutal numbers. I'm going to go through this real quick just to see how many, if he got 90% in any states. FDR did get 98.57% in South Carolina, which is absolutely insane. 97% Mississippi. The South really loved FDR because the South was always, post Reconstruction, always kind of neglected. FDR brought in the TVA. I guess the biggest thing that's standing to this day in the South is the TVA.
At least for us, I mean, we have FDR to thank for a lot of the development in Huntsville.
That's true. Yeah. No, FDR. He would definitely spread out development throughout the country through the New Deal. Let's get I think I'm looking through the electoral history if there's anything interesting to talk about outside of his absolute dominance. Wendell Willkie, he was a congressman from New York. I don't know if he was a congressman. He was a business.
He's just not Alf Landon.
He's not Alf Landon. That's the problem. But he did get more votes than Alf Landon. I don't know what happened. It must have been the Dust Bowl. Looking at the 1940 results here, Wendell Willkie did win South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Iowa, Indiana, and Michigan. Just to name a few states. So I think the Dust Bowl definitely played an impact on FDR here. What would you think? Just like looking at the electoral results here of the election in 1940.
The 1940 election is actually really interesting. I just finished up a paper actually for school talking about FDR running in 1940 because it was unprecedented. I think that's something we need to talk about too. Is that FDR is the reason that it's the 22nd Amendment, I believe, the 22nd two terms.
Mm-hmm.
FDR is pretty much the reason that exists, and he knew about the precedent, and he actually wanted to retire. He knew that his body was starting to fail him, and Eleanor wanted him to retire too. But because he really never said yes or no, the Democrats kind of just assumed that, okay, I guess this is our guy. Right? I guess this is what we're going to do. And so by the time the convention rolls around, he's just like, well, they're like, we're going to nominate you. He's like, okay, I guess. Oh, that sounds good. So I think that's maybe a criticism that's leveled on him. I'm not the biggest FDR fan ever, but I will say that the criticism of him being a tyrant for running for more than two terms is a little overblown. I get it. I definitely think he could have put his foot down and retired. Absolutely. Especially considering that we weren't in the war yet. But hindsight's 20/20. So I can't blame them too much for that. But he obviously did it, and then he runs again in 1944. At that point, I can't quite blame him either, although he does pass away pretty shortly into his fourth term. And then we get Harry Truman, who obviously makes, you could argue, the most consequential decision in world history. But I think that FDR, 1940, 1944, obviously the longer you're in power, the more people are going to oppose you. That's usually how that goes. So it doesn't surprise me that there were some pickups in 1940, 1944 as time goes on and people kind of tire with the way things are.
Yeah. And I mean, like, not to mention, actually, the 1940 election, the convention for the Democrats was interesting because the vice president, Henry A. Wallace, actually kind of got, like, thrown away by the Democratic caucus. And they were like, hey, if we know you have your health's worsening and everything, and we do not trust Vice President Wallace, who was I don't know what he was, Secretary of Agriculture in throughout, and the Secretary of Commerce.
I believe he was even more liberal than Roosevelt was.
I don't know about that, but he was opposed by the Catholic leaders in big cities, according to this article.
I don't know what that means.
He might have been too left wing, but that might be that might kind of might make sense from that at least. That being said, basically a lot of party leaders do not trust him to do the job of president if necessary, and then they suggest Senator Harry Truman from Missouri. Truman had a huge role in like the war effort in the Senate. He was very visible, I guess we could say, and very moderate. Missouri, Southern, I guess like a Southern Democrat. I don't really count Missouri as the South, but whatever. And it ended up being important because this is 1944, but still, Henry A. Wallace. This is just speeding up. Like, I don't know why I call this 1940, but that was a big move as we go into like a place where FDR's health is obviously becoming worse and worse. He died a year, not even a year, like 4 months, 5 months into his term.
Very shortly, yeah.
Because Harry Truman only ran for re-election once. It's crazy. So, I guess shout out to the Democratic leaders. Maybe I don't know what a Wallace presidency would look like, but shout out to them for making such a
what I will say is about FDR. I think now, because I guess we're far enough out where a lot of people who were alive during FDR's era have passed away, that we're starting to relook at least his economic policy. And that's obviously a political debate between people who what the fundamental role of government is, and that's definitely an interesting debate and an important debate. But I think actually the part of FDR that is going to be that is etched into world history is his foreign policy. FDR gets an A+ on foreign policy, from me at least. Lend-Lease is revolutionary, a revolutionary program, and that's something that we still use in a lot of ways today. And not that things like that hadn't necessarily done before, but FDR's role in the Lend-Lease program and supplying the Soviet Union and the UK with weapons and all sorts of different material, I think genuinely has made a tremendous positive impact on the world. Because I think people underestimate how close the German war machine was to genuinely decimating Europe. And so Lend-Lease, critical, especially before. And when you consider things like the embargo of Japan in terms of oil, yes, it provokes Pearl Harbor, but I think Roosevelt recognized that they didn't have resources, and that was why they were part of their entire reason for expanding and targeting like the Dutch East Indies and China and these other places, was because they needed resources they didn't have on their islands. So he recognized that, and the way that he was able to not weaponize, but basically weaponize American anger at what was happening in Pearl Harbor and what was going on in Europe, and mobilize that into, I'm going to go ahead and argue, the most potent war machine in the history of the world. I mean, we were producing more aircraft than Germany, UK, the Soviet Union combined. It was revolutionary and purely unbelievable. And then obviously the development of the Manhattan Project, the world's first nuclear weapons, that started under Roosevelt. The GI Bill, that's still used today. I think that Roosevelt's foreign policy is, obviously he made some pretty critical mistakes. Korematsu versus the United States, kind of his fault. Executive Order 9066. Yeah. Japanese internment, I don't think you can talk about foreign policy without Japanese internment. I said I would give him an A+ in terms of that, in terms of his general foreign policy. In terms of that, I guess you could call that more of domestic policy. Obviously, I think Korematsu is probably a top 5 worst decided case in the history of the Supreme Court.
It's up there, yeah.
It's certainly up there. And it was brutally unconstitutional and unfair and a violation of the civil rights of Asian Americans more broadly. But that's not saying that FDR didn't do some incredibly amazing things. He also, to his credit, didn't really interfere as much with the way that his military was functioning. He kind of let Eisenhower and Patton and those geniuses do what their job was, and they were great at. And I respect him a lot for not meddling with that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good things to say about FDR. There's a lot of bad things to say about FDR. But,
Yeah.
I mean, it is what it is. I think you laid it out pretty well there. I'm just looking at the electoral, breakdown. Not the map itself, but just kind of his impact on Democratic politics, especially. I think this is the first time, not the first time, but this is the last. This is kind of, FDR, I feel like, is the kind of a model for current progressives, and that's kind of an obvious statement. But if you look at, I know that technically people claim because this is the fifth, I think this would be the fifth party system, right? That FDR started. Yeah. I would argue that the sixth party system started after Truman left office, because when you see Truman start leaving office, this is where you get the rise of a conservative Democrat, a Southern Democrat domination on the national scale for their politics. Not that they're winning elections as much, but Adlai Stevenson running in 1952. Not exactly the same kind of Democrat as FDR. You had, even and then JFK, more progressive, but definitely a different vein. I would say, I don't know if you'd call that an aberration, but I think that FDR within himself was one whole party system shift in the United States, which is, I think, something that no other president is ever going to come close to matching. Maybe President Trump, just for how diverse and unique his voter base is and his support base is, but I don't think on an impact level and a real talent level there's anything like FDR, just from a political standpoint. I don't know how you feel about that, but yeah, it's just something I had to add in. Just looking at the age of American politics, I believe the FDR age is its own little subsect within it, which I find really fascinating.
Yeah, well, and I think another thing to mention too, and I guess getting back to domestic policy, but in terms of his appointments to the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, who presidential candidate in 1916, we forget, retires in 1941, and then there was another vacancy when James Clark McReynolds retires, and I believe there's another vacancy already. He elevates Harlan Stone to Chief Justice. James Burns and Robert Jackson are confirmed, and Burns decides he hates serving on the Supreme Court, so then Roosevelt nominates Wiley Rutledge. And so by then, he's got, 7 appointments? I mean, an unbelievable amount. Hugo Black is a hugely influential, and an Alabamian as well.
Yeah.
So I have a relative on my dad's side that was the police chief of Birmingham, and I think he knew Hugo Black when he was a young
Hugo Black famously names the courthouse in Birmingham, the federal courthouse in Birmingham. But FDR, his outside, the power he had at that level is frankly astounding. I mean, Hugo Black was there for 34 years. That's crazy.
I think FDR, and forgive me if I'm wrong, I think FDR, in terms of the free reign he was given, I think FDR had probably the third, I'm going to go with third most free reign of any president, probably ever. I would say Lincoln, maybe not even Lincoln. I don't even think Lincoln had the same amount of free reign as FDR did when it came to making policy. I would say Washington and then FDR, in terms of the amount of leverage and free reign that they had to genuinely craft national dialogue. I would go Washington and then FDR. I just think that he was immensely popular for a reason. I think he spoke to the things that a lot of people at the time wanted done, and that resonated with a lot of Americans, and especially his wartime policy. I think his wartime policy, regardless of how you feel about some of the other things, extremely competent, extremely effective.
Yeah.
Even when his health was declining.
I agree. I think even it kind of shows at such a desperate time in American life, frankly, you can do whatever you want as a president. I mean, FDR expanded the role of the president so much, for better or for worse, you can agree on politically, but for the time period he was in, I guess you can like it's understandable why he believed he had a higher role in like policy. He should have had a higher role in policymaking and being both a figurehead but also like a leader at the same time, which I think you can do in many different ways. But I think the way FDR did it was probably correct for the time being or for the time they were in. Now, I might not agree with no president giving that power back in the last 70 years, or the 80 years now. But regardless, I think his stature definitely will be like among the most famous, I guess, for any president in the future. I mean, I think outside of the four on Mount Rushmore, he's definitely probably fifth or sixth. If he had to replace Mount Rushmore heads, he's probably the next sixth man or fifth man up. I don't know. So yeah, what's your FDR ranking? Top. I say.
See, it's really hard for me, and I'm gonna get hate for it. I am not a fan of the New Deal policy. I'm just not. I think that the way, I don't think that economic bar. I understand why it came about. I think it's valid. I just don't think that. I think that the New Deal fundamentally changed in a bad way the role of government, specifically in the economy. I think that there were some good things. Like I do think that by and large, like the public works, like internal improvements, like the Henry Clay FDR style, like internal improvements and infrastructure. I think by and large that's a good thing. I don't necessarily have many issues with that. But just in terms of like Social Security, in terms of which is going to need to be reformed, at least in my opinion. But so I rank him pretty low on that just because I don't like the redefinition of the role of government in that. But in terms of the way that he handled probably one of the greatest threats, probably the second greatest threat, I would say the Civil War is probably number one in my opinion, and I guess the Revolution, but we didn't have technically a president then. So I'll go probably the second or third greatest threat to the history of the country, and he handled it not effortlessly, but extremely effectively. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that, for his leadership, for his revolution of the way presidents would use mass media. Both Roosevelts, incredibly effective speakers and articulators. And I think that there's a lot to do with that. And as much as it pains me in terms of the way I think about his economic policy and the way Korematsu and Executive Order 9066 pain me, I still think Roosevelt is probably 5 to 10 range. Probably. I'll go even stricter. Probably 5 to 7. If not, maybe five or 6. That's where I would put him.
Yeah, I think it's fair.
Even though I despise a lot of the economic policy,
I think it's fair.
I just think that the value that he added in terms of wartime leadership, and it was invaluable, and saved a lot of lives.
I agree. I think you can differ on economic policy, but you can recognize what he was, and he was definitely more than just a president in certain points at that time in American history. So I think it's fair. 5 to 10 is good with me too. Probably the president I differed most ideologically. That's in my top 10. But
I would agree.
Also, shout out to Calvin Coolidge, who we're not going to cover, but that's my guy.
That's my guy. Yeah.
Shout out to Calvin Coolidge. Also, one other interesting thing, just looking back, I think we're on track as of now. We are on track. Let me make sure I get the numbers right. But we are on track to have the first rematch. This is not really pertinent to this discussion, but we are on track to have the first rematch of presidential candidates since 1956, when Dwight D. Eisenhower ran against Adlai Stevenson II back to back. So he ran against him in 1952, destroyed him. For some reason, they renominated him. They got less electoral votes in 1956, and Eisenhower won 2 of the easiest elections since the 1800s, or since FDR maybe. But yeah, that's just something that's interesting to mention. I'm sure we'll talk about Eisenhower coming up soon, but that's what we're on track for right now in the United States. I guess 70 years on.
Well, the funny thing is how many more of these do we probably have? What, like 6 more of these to go?
Yeah, 4, 5, 6, something like that. Not too many.
Say we have 6 more to go. Actually, that's not true. I think next episode is 1960, right?
Yeah, JFK. Yeah.
JFK, and then I think the next important one is probably we could do 68, but I think I'd rather do 80.
80's good.
I think 80, and then 92,
80,
2000
92.
has to be on there. 2008, 2016, 2020's got to be on there.
And then we're
as a
done
recap.
with the history. Yeah.
So then, 1960, 1980, 92, 2000, 2008, 2016, 2020. So that's 7. So that's 7 more weeks worth of episodes, and then we get into 2024. But we've also got 2 more debates.
We got one more debate for sure. I don't know what they're doing with the debates, man. I mean, these debates are like such sideshows now. I mean, I know that the next debate is November 8th in Miami. Should have been Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Did not happen. Pretty disappointed about that.
We're totally not upset about it at all.
I know. I know that there's
not bitter.
I know there's some bitter folks in the ALGOP right now that unfortunately couldn't bring it home for us. But as of right now, the third GOP debate, November 8th, 2024, 4 candidates have qualified: President Trump, Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Nikki Haley. So the field has cut down a lot. As of now, Chris Christie has hit the polling requirements. Mike Pence has hit the polling requirements. Neither of them have reached the donor goals. The donor goals are much more stringent. Actually, I don't know if Mike Pence has hit the goals or not. Mike Pence is not. He has. Mike Pence and Tim Scott have hit the donor goal, or the state goal, the polling goals, not the money goals. As well as Chris Christie, not the money goals. So, and Will Hurd dropped out the other day and endorsed Nikki Haley. So that's where we're at. On the Republican primary side, candidates are going to start dropping out now. It's getting closer. Does this mean President Trump's going to get toppled? Frankly, I don't see any indications of that happening. But it is going to be interesting to see if this can make him actually come to a debate when there's less candidates. And I think that's something that will be interesting to watch moving forward now. Not if he loses, but will he start showing up? Which is the first step, I guess, right? If you're an anti-Trump guy.
I mean, there is so much going on right now in not only the country, but the world. I mean, we're on big war number 2.
Not even just in Israel right now, what's going on. Serbia and Kosovo might be starting up a war again. Just heard about that.
And there's obviously still Russia and Ukraine are still going at each other. Israel and Hamas.
Yeah.
Potentially even Syria and Lebanon. I saw there were rockets that were launched from both Syria and Lebanon today, so Absolutely. To be determined on that.
Yep.
I think the Korean Peninsula is a hotbed.
Africa's always going off too. I mean, just coups in half
Western
of Africa
Sahara,
right
if Morocco and Algeria decide to come to blows. Greece and Turkey.
Everything's on a knife's edge right now.
The big fish, China and Taiwan.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there are so many things teetering on a knife's edge, and the funny thing is like I've been politically conscious enough to hear people say 2016 was the most important election of our lives, and then they said the same thing in 2020, and the closer we get to 2024, I guarantee we're going to hear that again because the tensions just keep getting higher and higher and higher, and everything keeps getting worse and worse and worse.
Yep.
It's gonna be.
Not to mention, we don't have a Speaker of the House. Government
tomorrow.
shutdown.
Tomorrow.
Oh, that's true.
Maybe
there's a Speaker of the House tomorrow. Government shutdown's looming. In November, no Speaker.
Just vibes.
Welcome to the world. So yeah, we're gonna cover all of this. Don't worry. We got new articles coming out every couple of days on pppolitical.com. I actually just wrote an article on Robert F. Kennedy's switch to the independent bid for president, how that might affect the election. And as of right now, it seems like there is indication it will affect the election. I just want, again, I've reiterated this to many people, I just want an election with 3 candidates on the Wikipedia page, which means RFK needs to do, get like 7% nationally or something? I don't know. But a lot of stuff happening. We're covering it all. Thank y'all for listening. Thank y'all for reading. Share it around. All of that. Follow us. We're always posting on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Shorts. Yeah, all of that. So y'all check it out. And the website, pppolitical.com.
Grind doesn't stop.
Grind doesn't stop. So, with all that being said, thank y'all for listening. I'm Eshan Pokrall,
And I'm Michael Boddicker.
and goodbye.